So the Georgia is a really strange ship. It never fought a battle. Nobody died on it. There's no sunken treasure. It will probably never be in a Hollywood movie, but it is a weird ship and it's a fascinating story. And the long and short of it is that it was scratch built in Savannah, Georgia, with locally sourced materials, with money raised by women in 1862 and 3. And 5 of the 22 women who led the effort were Jewish. So it's a strange story about women in the war, Jews in the Confederacy, local shipbuilding, and a lot of other things that I'll talk about in a minute. I found out about the Georgia from the late Judy Wood. And Judy was the dean of coastal archaeologists in Georgia for many years. And she was, I think her job title was environmental compliance officer for the Savannah district of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But really her passion was shipwrecks on the Georgia coast. She maintained an extensive library and had a database that sourced, period newspaper reports, other historical documents, and created a spreadsheet of all the shipwrecks in coastal Georgia. So she was the connection to everything. And she single-handedly fought and saved the wreck of the Georgia from being plowed through by the Corps of Engineers on at least one occasion and probably more. And she passed away in 2015, regrettably, right before they started raising this wreck. So she was kind of like the Moses of the CSS Georgia. Thanks to Judy, I did some TV news reporting when I worked at the NBC affiliate in Savannah about the Georgia. I did this really strange one-off documentary in 2008 where I used it as a chance to go aboard the submarine USS Georgia and talk about 2 Georgias, which was really just a fun excuse to go to sea on a nuclear submarine out of Kings Bay. I did my master's thesis on the Georgia for a master's in public history at Armstrong Atlantic State, which is in Savannah. So this is the bound version of that. It doesn't make a very good PowerPoint image. So that was the next step. When I was married, the Georgia was my groom's cake. So you could say I've really got a serious hang up about this ship. And I got to produce the Corps of Engineers documentary starting in 2015. And that was a 3-year-long gig. And then I got so interested in the ship that I did the subsequent research that Smitty talked about and wound up contributing in a chapter to this massive tome. This is the 500+ page final archaeological report that was filed for the Corps of Engineers that was just publicized a couple of months ago. So this has been a long journey. And as Smitty indicated, it's led to another shipwreck in the river. But I think what I'd like to do first is kind of wet your whistle by giving you a really short 1 or 2 minute clip from the beginning of that official documentary that will show you kind of what it was like for the people who were diving on the Georgia. And then we can rewind and talk about the ship's history. So here's the beginning of the film on the CSS Georgia. Actually, you know what? Let me stop the share and start it again because I don't think I turned the share sound on, and I want you to be able to hear. So here we go.
Red diver, under the water when ready.
There you go.
On a sweltering summer day in Savannah, Georgia, a team of U.S. Navy divers, guided by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers archaeologists, splashed into the murky waters of the Savannah River. This was the watery grave of the Civil War ironclad CSS Georgia.
One of the most interesting wreck sites that I've ever worked on has some of the most amazing artifacts one could hope for on a wreck.
The dives in 2015 represented the final stages of more than 40 years of archaeological study and offered the promise of artifacts and information about one of the nation's most significant yet mysterious shipwrecks.
So this is our one chance to really understand the Georgia, how it was constructed, what it looked like.
We probably know less about the Georgia than we do any other Confederate ironclad. So everything, every scrap of material, every fragment of machinery is going to tell us a little bit more about the Georgia.
But the work would not be easy. It would require many thousands of dollars worth of specialized electronics and 274 dives into one of the most challenging underwater environments imaginable.
The CSS Georgia doesn't give up her secrets very easily.
This is the story of the recovery of the CSS Georgia.
So that's the first couple of minutes of the film. It was actually finished in 2017. So I had started shooting that when I spoke to you back in 2016. Since I posted it on YouTube, it's been viewed about 1.5 million times. So a lot of people have seen it. And I will share the YouTube link with you in the chat as we get towards the end of the presentation, and then Smitty can email it back out for any who miss it. But the story of the Georgia really starts in the early days of the war. As you probably know, if you've heard me speak about this or read about it, the South had a surfeit of highly experienced naval officers, former U.S. Navy officers who resigned their commissions, but they had no ships. So they had to purpose build their ships. And the Battle of Hampton Roads in March of 1862 marks the kind of the zenith of Confederate shipbuilding and the entrance of a new kind of ship, which is, of course, the Ironclad warship. The Confederate CSS Virginia was the first ironclad, and it wreaked havoc on the Federal fleet in Hampton Roads until it was checked the next day by the first Union ironclad, the Monitor. And these vessels became kind of the first in class. So from this point forward, most Confederate ironclads looked like the Virginia, kind of the slope-sided iron box on a flat deck. And most Union ironclads, but not all, looked like the Monitor. They had 1 or 2 turrets, and that's kind of the precursor of the modern battleship turret that we're so familiar with, and were barely visible above the waterline, aside from those turrets. So here again is the typical Confederate ironclad. Now, if you move down to Savannah, Georgia, down the coast from Virginia, you'll find a city that is just completely bottled up by the Union blockade. The cotton that was the lifeblood of the city was rotting in the port, and things got even worse in April of '62 when Fort Pulaski, which was a massive 1 million brick fortification that a young Lieutenant Robert E. Lee had helped to build early in his career in the 1840s. It was considered impregnable, but it fell to the Union after the first use of rifled cannons on a fortification. This story kind of gets overlooked because it happened on the same day as the Battle of Shiloh, but this really made history. And it was the accuracy of those rifled cannon that allowed them to punch through those 12-foot thick brick walls. So what is Savannah to do? Well, as is often the case in Savannah history, because women usually save the houses that turn into museums, and women were the first to realize the value of tourism in Savannah. In the Civil War, it was women who realized something needed to be done to help the Navy. This is a engraving of women serving as nurses, and at the top of the screen here, you see women sewing uniforms and flags. In Savannah, women rolled cartridges. One of the Confederate officers remarked that he was complaining that he couldn't light a cigar in his parlor because it would blow the house up because his wife and all her friends were rolling cartridges for the infantry. But in Savannah, those women also created a gunboat society, and they wanted to build an ironclad like the Virginia that they could steam down the Savannah River, liberate Fort Pulaski, lift the blockade, and open the port back up. So on the left, and this is in the same issue of the Savannah Republican, you've got the 22 women from the Savannah Ladies Gunboat Society on the left, and these are the names or the wives of prominent merchants in Savannah. Octavius Cohen was a member of Temple Mikveh, Israel. Also the Sheftals, that's an old Revolutionary War colonial Savannah Jewish family dating back to 1733. Another Cohen here, the Levies, McCall. So there's kind of a who's who of the merchant class of Savannah. In the same paper, the same day they announced the formation of their group, they've got a concert where they're going to raise money. So they're literally having a benefit concert to raise money to build their own ironclad warship. And if I give this presentation in person, I'll ask people if they recognize the guy on the left. Since I can't see your faces and you're muted, I'll just tell you who he is. This is James Lord Pierpont, who was a member of a powerful abolitionist family that was close to the Lincolns. They were New Englanders. James's brother John was the minister at the Unitarian Church in Savannah, and James came to be the organist. While he was in Savannah before the war, he wrote Jingle Bells, which was actually titled One Horse Open Sleigh. So he is now famous for that, and they have the Jingle Bells Church in Savannah where he worked. But unbeknownst to most tour guides and historians, he stayed in Savannah during the war married a Southern girl, joined the Confederate cavalry, and wrote battle songs for the South. And they're not very good. They Jingle Bells kind of leaves them in its dust. One of them was Our Battle Flag, and that's one of the songs that they performed to raise money for the Georgia. So that's kind of an interesting wrinkle. Over the course of just a few weeks, and during the construction of the ship, so they're raising the money while they're building, which is not a way to run a fundraising campaign. I know that from my work in museum. They raised the equivalent of $2.5 million. And this money was poured into the shipbuilding effort. We think the ship was built on right up here, northeastern Savannah on the waterfront. It's kind of hard to tell because shipyards changed names during the war. Because Savannah was under blockade, had very little iron, and they couldn't roll out the iron plate that was used on most Confederate ironclad armor, they seized railroad rails from a northern-owned railroad. It's wonderful when you can steal your enemy's stuff and put it to use against him. And they sheathed the side of the ship, the visible part above the waterline, in railroad rail. And you can see how the rails interlock. So if you put one up, one down, one up, one down, you can make a smooth wall of what would look like wooden rails, but is actually really heavy, really thick, somewhat brittle railroad rail. So that's how they armored the Georgia. Those rails, as you see in this diagram, were attached to the top of 2 feet of wood. You've got oak, pine, oak, and the fastener goes all the way through. So that's how the ship was armored. One of probably 3 Confederate ironclads that were armored with iron. Now, because there were no photographers working in Savannah at the time and nobody drew a picture and the plans have vanished, and this was kind of an ad hoc effort, we have 3 images of the Georgia, all drawn for Union newspapers based on verbal reports. And they're all wrong for different reasons. This one has horizontal rather than vertical rails for the armor. This one has no smokestack, which would have been really unfortunate for a steam-powered vessel. You'd smoke out the inside. And this one has too many cannons on the end. We know there were single cannons on the end. There was a photograph that was believed to be a real picture of the Georgia, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but this might have been the only photograph. So the Georgia, unfortunately for its builders, and especially for the women who raised all the money and their donors around the state, was a huge disappointment. It was not able to power itself against the tide in the Savannah River. So what do you do with a ship you can't move? You park it and you make it a floating fort. And as a floating fort, it was really useful, especially in tandem with the other devices that the Confederates had to block the river. And bear in mind, the river has fallen to the Union. There's a massive Yankee fort right down the river, and the enemy is within spitting distance. So the Confederates, as quickly as they could, blocked up the river. So now the concern is not just to stop the blockade, it's to stop the Union ships from coming up the river and shelling the city, right? So they've got floating explosives that they call torpedoes. That's what Admiral Farragut was talking about when he said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. In this case, a torpedo is really a mine. And here's another picture of different types of mines. So it's just basically a barrel of gunpowder with a percussion cap on it floating just below the surface. They also built something called cribs. And this is a massive, like 40-foot square wooden box that you tow out behind a steam tug, anchor in place, and you just drop rocks and bricks in it until it sinks. And there are still Civil War era Confederate crib remnants in the Savannah River. They were that good. They really blocked the river up. So the Georgia becomes anchored in the middle of this as kind of a piece of a set of obstructions. So I want to play this clip from the film. This is computer animation of the Georgia put in context with Fort Jackson and 3 dirt forts that the Confederates built and all those obstructions. So this will show you how it was kind of like the lock, the key in the lock that locked up the Savannah River to protect it from Union attack. And my computer is coming back to life.
The Georgia was an important part of a system of defensive fortifications protecting Savannah from attack by sea. The ironclad was stationed in front of Fort Jackson, a brick structure mounting up to 7 cannons. Just downstream sat Battery Lee, the strongest fort in the system. This earthen fortification boasted 9 cannons and 2 mortars. In the river itself, invaders faced submerged explosives and obstacles driven into the sand. Confederate Navy sailors manned 5 cannons placed in a man-made island in the river across from Fort Jackson, and behind that were another 6 cannons at Battery Lawton. Disappointed Savannahans quickly forgot about the CSS Georgia, but little did they know the ship was helping to save their city.
So you got to really hand it to the Southerners. They were had remarkable ingenuity and used dirt and cannons to make forts and a failed ironclad to make an impregnable blockade to keep the Union troops from coming up.
The Georgia.
Confederate shipbuilders did produce a couple more ironclads, the Atlanta and the Savannah, and the Atlanta was great. It was a functioning ironclad that could go to sea, but it did go to sea, ground on a sandbar, and was pounded into submission, surrendered, and became the USS Atlanta. So that ended poorly for the Southerners. The Savannah was working, but was stuck behind the blockades, behind the obstructions, I should say, until General Sherman comes, and he has his infamous march through Georgia where he says, "I will make Georgia howl." He burns and pillages his way through the state, makes it to Georgia, and makes it to Savannah, I should say, and the Confederate army is outnumbered 6-1. And rather than putting up a fight, they take rice barges like the one in this image, stretch them, connect them and stretch them end to end across the river, and the entire 10,000-man army literally walks across the river into South Carolina. They set the barges on fire, cut them loose, and just close it up behind them, and they're done. So Savannah just is handed over as an undefended city to Sherman. That final ironclad, the CSS Savannah, is blown up by its crew. The Georgia is sunk, and the Georgia was easy to sink. They just turned off the steam engine, so the pump stopped working, and it sank like a rock. The last image that we have of the Georgia, the last appearance in any document, is in the 1872 Coastal Survey. And you can see here it's got 11 feet of water on top of it. And the description is that she sits where she lies with all of her machinery and her armaments and her iron, and they estimate the weight and the value of it. So after this, the Georgia just kind of vanishes. Now, since I last spoke to you, I took a deep dive into what happened in those last few years, because the archaeologists who recovered the wreckage in the last 5 years didn't find an intact shipwreck. They found an exploded mess on the bottom. So it's clear that it had been explosively salvaged with dynamite. And even more interesting, they found stacks of identical artifacts that had been taken off the wreck, recovered, stacked up, and then pushed overboard off the barge, presumably in the 1860s. So the question became, who would have salvaged this and then thrown it back, and why would they do that? So I found newspaper evidence of U.S. Navy divers working the wreck in 1865. This is right after Sherman came. And they're working to open the river up so Union naval vessels and merchant ships can come in and Savannah can get back in business. And as a quick aside, it's interesting, Savannah surrendered and literally 2 weeks later voted to rejoin the Union. So the war isn't even over yet. Savannahans they still have brothers, fathers, sons, fighting in the war. They've got a Confederate congressman in Richmond, and they're like, we're done. We want to get back in business with the North. Can we be an American city again? And the Union says, sure. So they're trying to open it up. In May of '66, this vessel, the Lizzie Baker, which was one of the Florida coastwise steamers, struck a wreck that turned out to be the Georgia. So that's the first time it appears in the news after the war. They put out a notice, look out for this wreck, it'll snag you. And the city lets out a contract to one of the former Navy divers, and he's going to come and salvage the Georgia and sell it for his own benefit, and they'll get the harbor unblocked and everybody will be happy. Unfortunately, Henry Wells of New York has a problem with that. And this is the discovery that I made. Wells is a New York industrialist, and it was his railroad that they stole the rails from to armor the Georgia. So he makes a case that this is his iron armor. And he goes to the Treasury Department, which was kind of in charge of taking any Confederate stuff and selling it for Union benefit to pay off the war debt. Wells makes his case, and the federal government says, yes, you can go salvage the Georgia. You just need to clean everything else out of the river, including all those cribs and the other wrecks. So Wells has a big job. It lasted about 2 years. He's got hard hat divers working on the wreck, not too terribly different from what the U.S. Navy did in the 2000s. And they do a pretty good job. They clear out a lot of cribs and raise some vessels, and there are a bunch of wrecks in the river at this point. But he doesn't finish. There's a change of administration. Johnson is impeached, but stays in office, leaves office, and we get President Grant. And President Grant says, we're out of the shipwreck raising business. I want no more of this. And so in the National Archives, researchers that I hired found entire books full of letters between Wells and the Treasury Department and his agents and people complaining in Savannah about the poor work back and forth. It's going too slowly. He's blowing the tops off of these obstructions, but leaving the bases, and ships are striking them at low tide. And what's going on? And when are we going to get him fired? And when is this going to get raised? And I found indications that Wells was fired. He lost his contract, but he was given verbal permission to keep working the Georgia. And his foreman says, and this is a quote here, "I have hold of the wreck of the Georgia." So I'm 99% sure, based on the circumstantial evidence, that what happened is Wells had started salvaging the ship and was making progress. When he lost the gig, he had his foreman throw everything else overboard. So that's why the wreck is exploded, salvaged, and thrown back. And interestingly, he does get paid by Congress because the Corps of Engineers said, yeah, you know, we couldn't have done a better job. He's not at fault. So Wells gets his money. He doesn't really care about the Georgia anymore. If he can't sell it, he wants somebody else to have to raise it themselves and not benefit from his work. But the really remarkable thing about what I found in the National Archives were these letters. These are depositions or affidavits of the Georgia shipbuilders. And there was just no real record of the building of the ship other than the newspaper record. These are handwritten transcripts of the deposition of the Georgia's builders that are entered into the Treasury Department records because Wells deposed these people. And they talk about where they got the iron and how much iron they had. So this proves that it was Henry Wells' iron. And the X marks the spot map that Smitty was talking about. This is that map. This map was known about. We had letters about the map, but the map was missing until my team found it in the National Archives with those letters in the Treasury Department record. This is a coast survey done by a lieutenant aboard the USS Bibb. And boom, there you see it, CSS Georgia. There's that earthen battery in the middle of the river. Here's Fort Jackson and Fort Lee. So this is a really valuable piece of evidence. And he's got the soundings here of all the different obstructions in the river. And you can see these lines are the lines of the cribs that were there. So that's a really valuable map. After that, the Georgia vanishes for the better part of a century. And it's completely forgotten about until 1968 when this dredge hits it. And they call in an expert from Fort Pulaski who says, I think that's the ladies' Ironclad, the CSS Georgia. And now there's a Ironclad fever. Everybody wants to raise the ship. And incredibly, after decades of archaeological study, nobody was talking about what happened in the 1960s. So I dug this up. This is a front page article from the Savannah Morning News. They brought divers down from the Charleston Navy base to dive on the wreck. And these were the first modern divers that we know of to dive on the Georgia. They brought up a few pieces. And this is the coolest part. Lou Tew is a grizzled old Navy diver who is believed to be the inspiration for Robert De Niro's character in Men of Honor. So he's the quintessential diver's diver in the Navy. And I found him. He, at least as of 2017, was still alive up in Connecticut. And I was able to interview him and include his recollections in the video, which was just a wonderful find. After this, the Georgia kind of goes into like an orphan period. Nobody knows what to do with this thing. Nobody has the money to raise it. It's in the way. What are we going to do with it? The Corps of Engineers tries to get rid of it. They tell a contractor, just plow through it. It's an obstacle. Nobody wants it. The contractor didn't want to do that. So the contractor suggested a totally unworkable plan. They said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to dig a trench underwater and just drag it with dredges into the trench and rebury it. And that was so preposterous and so destructive that the Corps said, all right, fine, just leave it there. We'll dredge around it. And it stayed. Then the question became, who owns the wreck? State law said it was the states. The state deeded it to the Corps of Engineers. The Corps paid $1 for it, but then that was made moot when it was ruled by Congress to belong to the Navy. And this is the same, the Sunken Military Craft Act is the same law that says German U-boats, Confederate warships, any enemy ship that's sunk in American waters belongs to the U.S. Navy. So that settled that question for what it's worth. And I believe when I spoke to y'all, I was just, in 2016, I was just starting to meet people who were involved with the early archaeology on the Georgia in the 70s and 80s. And I think that Rick Anuskowitz, who lives about 30 minutes outside of Sarasota, came to our presentation that night at your library there, and I was able to interview him. So this is the final fruits of the things I was finding out when I last spoke to you. The first sonar survey was done in 1978. This is a scientist from the Skidaway Marine Institute in Savannah with the actual sonar that he used. And I was super excited to get this picture. In 78, there was an Army Corps colonel who was super excited about the Georgia, and he kind of stood up a multidisciplinary dive team. So this is lawyers, engineers, anybody who does anything for the Corps of Engineers and wants to be a scuba diver, they get to go dive on the CSS Georgia. So this is like the Wild West, okay? If you remember those Burt Reynolds movies like Cannonball Run, this is Cannonball Run archaeology style on the Savannah River. And the photographer, Jorden, who worked for the Corps, saved all of his slides and shared them with me. So I have this treasure trove of color and black and white images of this period. And look what's flying over the barge here. You're not going to see that on a Corps of Engineers vessel in 2022. They did a little bit of hard hat diving and brought a few things up and did some side scan sonar surveys. And you can see here's the iron casemate of the wreck. It's just kind of a scattered mess of stuff. And then this is what I refer to as the Daisy Dukes picture. The story is that these three gentlemen were trying to impress Judy Wood, the young female archaeologist. So they dressed like this, and she was horrified and laughed at them behind their backs. But the substance of this picture is that they are raising unexploded cannonballs and rifled cannon shells in these barrels. So divers on the bottom put the cannonballs in the barrel, and then they raise the barrel with a pulley onto the deck. So that's what's happening. Here they are taking the rifle shell out. And there's Rick Anuskowitz, your Florida neighbor, doing the early work. 2 cannons were raised, and this happened on Confederate Memorial Day, and they had a huge crowd of reenactors and Savannah citizens and tourists who ate barbecue at Old Fort Jackson and watched the cannons coming out of water. 24-pounder, and this one was placed in the moat at Fort Jackson until they could put it in an electrolysis tank, and there it is going in the moat. Another picture from Jonas Jorden. And then the big 32-pounder rifle, a banded rifle, comes out, and it's too big for the moat, so they dig a trench and put it in the trench until they can put it in electrolysis. And here you can see the maker's mark on the trunnion, which is the arms of the cannon that rest on the carriage going into the ditch there. And a great picture from the newspaper. And the funny thing is, because these were technically still loaded, they sent the cannons by truck up to the Marine Corps Air Station beside Parris Island up in Beaufort, South Carolina, where they were inerted. So this is kind of a behind-the-scenes photo of those cannons being rendered safe to put on exhibit. And those are now on exhibit at Fort Jackson, which is a locally operated museum in Savannah. Now, I told you this was the Wild West, and to think about Burt Reynolds, and you've got Confederate flags. I hope you're not offended by this, but I think it's a great picture. I couldn't use it in the documentary because the Corps of Engineers would have quashed it, but they went to the trouble of putting a helicopter in the air to get a great aerial shot of the dive barge, and lo and behold, the archaeologists here, really the dive team mooned the helicopter. There's also a great cartoonist working on the team, and this is his large cartoon about the CSS Georgia dives. It's my understanding that they sent somebody to shore to get fried chicken for lunch every day. And I'm told by a handful of the guys that they were also enjoying a good smoke in between the fried chicken. So this was kind of like the crazy period of CSS Georgia archaeology. And then after that, we enter another period of neglect. So between 1984 and 2003, when I got back involved and started learning about this, nobody dove on the Georgia again. So the ship is neglected. What changes all of that? Well, I don't know if you're aware, but Savannah has this sleepy little southern town, tourist town, has become the 4th largest container port in the country. A couple months ago, they had 80,000 containers backed up trying to get out of the port by truck because of the logistics snarl. 9 or 10 ships offshore every day waiting to come in. Even before COVID, there was just a lot of pressure on this port. So they started a $760 million harbor deepening project, and the Georgia is in the way. And because it belongs to the Navy, it has to be raised. It can't be destroyed. So they earmarked about $14 million to raise the Georgia. First dives were in 2003. They're re-examining it, producing a site map. And I'm going to go through these slides quickly because I don't want to take too much of our time, and I want to make sure that we get you done on time. This is an interesting image. This is the 1981 sonar image of a part of the casemate. And here's a 2003 side scan sonar. And you can see the red square marking a piece that has been broken off, presumably by a ship strike. So they showed that the wreck was in danger. Two more images here, two pieces in red from this casemate section. And the casemate is the iron armored top of the ship. This is a casemate section, again, broken off by 2003. So we take another 10 months off while they try to get Congress to approve the deepening project. In 2013, the work starts in earnest. We get a wonderful 360 degree 3D sonar image of the wreck site. And you can see where this is the South Carolina shore, and it slopes down into the river. Here's the dredge scars from all the constant dredging. You got channel anchors, piece of the propeller, some cannons. So they're starting to get a better image of the wreck. And then this is a wonderful sonar image that really kind of gives you a look top down in relief at what the site looked like. They raised a test segment of casemate. And you can see it looks like concrete, but this is just concretion, just natural things that have happened, and also possibly some sort of cement that was smeared on the outside of those railroad rails. Navy divers were involved in this. This is the piece in the daylight the next day. The wood was found to be just chewed up by shipworms, the Torpedoes nivalis shipworm, but the iron was solid. They took it to Texas A&M, to the Conservation Research Lab, and subjected it to pressure tests until it broke, so they could find out just how much stress the casemate could take without breaking when they raised the big pieces. And this is that stress test. So the actual raising of the Georgia starts the year before I saw you last, in January of 2015. This is archaeological hard hat divers. They raised 1,600 small artifacts that were placed in bins at the Corps of Engineers Depot. This is everything from bricks and prehistoric pottery that washed into the wreck, to brass pieces that were parts of the devices that raised and lowered the cannon, pulley wheels, the device that you use to push the cannon from side to side. Those are really rare in Civil War shipwrecks. Shackles for sailors who were drunk and disorderly, bayonet handles, trigger guards, bottles, just all kinds of little things. Phase two, we bring those Navy divers back in, and we put a barge over the side. And this was the year of the Navy diver for Navy Public Affairs. So it was a huge PR blitz. Two cranes were working the site. There's that topographical map again. They got EOD divers, the guys who go in and blow things up underwater, who would have worked in mines in Iraq and do all kinds of secret things around the world, along with Navy salvage divers, who are the divers who might change the propeller on a submarine while it's still underwater. So just incredible underwater MacGyver type people. If you remember the show MacGyver from back in the 80s, the guy who could like save the world with a piece of tape and a paperclip. These were those guys. They gridded the wreck out and worked within these grids, so you would always know where you were on the wreck. The divers have sonar transmitters. You can see one on the back of the tank here. Cameras. And this is what they look like on the surface, so they're fully kitted out, working while the freighters were going up and down the river. So this was an incredibly dangerous and busy site. And they had a real-time diver tracking system. So these black lines indicate the movement of the diver in the water over time. And they use the same transmitters on cages that the artifacts were brought up in. So you always know where the diver is and where the thing that he's raising is. And again, you can see the track of the diver moving through the water. And the coolest part of all of this, the thing that was the most Star Trek, looked like something out of NASA Mission Control, was an $80,000 CODA sonar system that's a real-time 3D. This is just a screen grab. But because this water is so brackish and so dense that you can only see about 6 inches in front of your face, this created, it looked like an infrared image. They could actually see the divers moving around on the bottom and see the cannons being lifted from the bottom in real time. They found, I think, roughly 200 over the course of the project, unexploded cannonballs and shells. So those were brought up. They placed them off to the side and put buoys on them. So we called it the forest of explosives. It was off to the side. Then came the cannons. This is a 9-inch Dahlgren naval gun. You've got a banded rifle 32-pounder, another 32-pounder. These were, kept moist and shrink wrapped And there, for perspective, that's me with, I think that's one of the 32 pounders. In total, 6 cannons were raised, if you include the 2 from 1984. Then came the propeller. And this is the only surviving propeller. And they can tell by the way it's machined, whether it was a single or a pair. So they know by the way it's shaped, there had to be a second one. And this gives clues about the way the ship was built. And the artifact that I showed you earlier turns out to be the brass plate that went on top of the propeller shaft to keep the propeller from bucking when you put it into reverse. So these, you can see how these pieces fit together. And when they finished the detail work, they brought in this thing that looks like something out of Lord of the Rings. This is a clamshell, and they just scooped the mud off the bottom, 1 scoop at a time, marking it by grid so they know exactly where each scoop came from. And archaeologists and high waders hosed it off with fire hoses to see what it contained. And lo and behold, there was another cannon in the mix that nobody knew about. So we get that other Dahlgren cannon. And this is where the really rich diversity archaeologically of the site became clear. There were 32,000 artifacts, and the bulk of that happened in this clamshell phase. And, you know, working from Knoxville, coming down to Savannah on certain weekends and weekdays to film this work, I thought, you know, clamshell archaeology, that's just cleaning up the mess after they're done. They're probably not going to find anything. They were astonished at what they found. This is the hilt of a short sword and the buckle that goes with it from a Mexican-American War kit. So this is somebody's personal, some veteran's personal kit from the war, you know, 25 years earlier that he brought to use on the CSS Georgia. Weapons, buttons, that's a state of Georgia button. You can see the Georgia state seal there. And in the end, and this is going to be upsetting, I think, to many of you, the majority of what was found were disarticulated piece of broken rail or other pieces of metal that had no matching ends and could not be explained in any way. It was all measured and studied, and anything that wasn't usable was reburied in a safe spot on the river. And they put it outside the reach of the port in a shallow area where nobody ever goes except with motorboats, and it would be impossible for anybody to get in these containers. But if a future archaeologist wanted to find it, they could say, oh, that's in container 3B, grid square 2, and it's got a transponder on it, so you can find it. But this leaves the 2 large sections of the casemate, that iron armor that was made out of railroad rails. And this is what they look like. They got one of them up and it started to buckle, and so they put it back down. This is in, again, bear in mind, this is summer and fall of 2015. They came back in 2017 to get those. But first, let's revisit that photograph. And this is a funny story. Remember the picture that might be an authentic picture of the Georgia? It turns out it's not. It was a complete hoax that was perpetrated in the 1980s by a teenager in Savannah. That's a snapshot he took of him and his brother making the model. They created their own film about the Ironclad and then took the picture of it and aged it with Elmer's glue and pawned it off and convinced archaeologists and historians that it was a real picture. This is a terrible picture of the guy. His name is John Potter. There's the model itself and the photo. And this is the frame now. He's got a picture of his deceased pug in it. So the CSS Georgia photo was a complete hoax, and the guy who did it was kind of a local legend. There's a plaque. He was the maintenance man at the Tybee Island Lighthouse Museum, and there's a plaque on the wall of a bar on Tybee Island that says he finished 77 PBRs in one night. So he's truly a legend. He could outdrink a horse and fool archaeologists with his Elmer's glue and snapshot, his Polaroid. In any case, all of the artifacts that did not go back in the water, and this includes all those buttons and swords and weapons and thousands of other things, and all the cannonballs go to Texas, to the Conservation Research Lab at Texas A&M. They arrive in shipping containers. The large vats contain the cannons and anchor fragments and casemate fragments. So I went there, I think right before I saw you last, and filmed and photographed at that lab. They had to clean off, and these are grad students in the highly regarded marine archaeological program at Texas A&M. So they're cleaning the concretions off of these cannonballs. They did X-ray on the smaller artifacts that were globbed up in concretion so you can see what's inside. So here's a padlock, which, you know, inside still has all the mechanisms that still work. And in 2017, the Corps comes back with a bigger barge and a bigger crane, and they're finally able to raise those remaining casemate sections. So here's the east casemate. This is the CODA sonar image of it being raised, a drone shot. These are brought up, another drone shot. So this is that massive west casemate section. And they hose it off, and man, let me tell you, I love the smell of a salt marsh. I love oysters, but I did not enjoy the smell of 150 years of pluff mud, which was pretty angry at being exposed to the air. It really stank, and there were crabs crawling all over it and fish flopping everywhere. Thick layer of mussels on the outside. They cleaned all of that off, and here, after 150 years, is the ironed armor of the CSS Georgia. And you can see it's that upside down, right side up rail interlocked along the edge. They found out that it had 7 different gauges of rail on it. So it was a real, really tells a story about how the ship was built. Gunport remains. This is, shows how the gunports were made with plate iron separately from the railroad iron. And you can see the sharp angle that was at the corner of the casemate. They did what's called photogrammetry, which is where an individual takes hundreds of pictures of the large artifact, and these are stitched together into a mosaic that can be animated like video. So they are able to zoom in to a fraction of an inch and see this, and this becomes a permanent record for archaeologists who want to study it later. Photogrammetry. They did another round of grappling, and this time they didn't find any swords and buttons, but they did find pieces of the steam engine, which answers a lot of questions and solves mysteries about how the ship was powered and where that engine came from. And they're still trying to figure out what ship the engine was taken from, because we know it wasn't purpose-built, but it explains finally why the Georgia was so underpowered. And this allows the archaeologists to reconstruct that engine using engineering principles. So again, another archaeological tragedy. The casemate cleaned off, photographed, studied, measured, is reburied again in the back river in safety. And this is because nobody had the $1 or $2 million it would take to meet Navy standards to conserve and exhibit this. And just conserving it would involve a massive electrolysis tank. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. To exhibit it would require Smithsonian standards, really, and nobody could meet that in Savannah. And this is in 2017. This is before it became even more difficult to raise any money to talk about anything to do with the Civil War. As you know, Civil War museums have been under attack since the BLM protests in 2020. The iron fantail of another Confederate ironclad was burned by an arsonist around that time. So I don't think these will come out of the water anytime soon. But the good news is they've been studied and photographed. And here they are being reburied. The Georgia story now is told by my film that I'll send you the link to in a moment. I'll share it with you. We were able to do a historical marker at Fort Jackson to talk about the remarkable accomplishments of the ladies who funded this work. And the big question is, what happens next with the ship? As you know, that the big casemate sections are back in the water, but you've still got the 5 cannons now, which have been recovered in addition to the 2 that are at Fort Jackson, plus all those small artifacts. And these include things like dominoes and the reed of a harmonica, things that really tell the story of individual life of the sailor on the ship. And I just found out, I've confirmed as of this morning, that the Port Columbus Civil War Navy Museum in Columbus, Georgia, will be receiving the first shipment of CSS Georgia artifacts probably next month. So you'll eventually be able to see them. And my last few slides here before I take questions and we can talk about the Revolutionary War shipwreck that Smitty mentioned. Just for your information, there are only a handful of other recovered Civil War ironclad wrecks. The best example, Union or Confederate, is in Vicksburg, Mississippi. This is the river ironclad Cairo, which was a Union ship. The first ship in the world sunk by an electrically detonated mine. So this means there's a soldier hiding in the woods on the side of the river that puts 2 wires together, blows up an explosive and sinks the ship. No lives were lost. The ship was just swallowed by the mud in the Mississippi River, and it was raised intact in the 1960s. And you can literally walk around inside this wreck at Vicksburg National Military Park. The USS Monitor, one of the most famous ironclads in the world from the Battle of Hampton Roads, pieces of it were recovered and are now exhibited in the Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum in Newport News. The CSS Noose in Kinston, North Carolina, is the opposite of the Georgia. The Georgia has no hull left. The Noose has a hull but no casemate. So what they've done is they've ghosted the iron armor on top. This is kind of like Franklin's house in Philadelphia. You get the shape of it with a modern frame that suggests what was there. And they've done the same thing with the hull of the Jackson at Port Columbus. So when they get these pieces from the Georgia, they can tell more of a complete story about a Confederate ironclad. And obviously what would be really cool would be if you could hang those casemate sections up here, but you know, those things are 24 feet tall and 40 feet wide and back underwater. So that won't happen. So with that, I've been talking a long time, and I think I've kept you within the hour. I know that historians that I know, we're so infamous for launching unbidden into stories that glaze people's eyes over that one of my friends has a jar. You know, some people have a swear jar where you put a quarter in every time you say a bad word. He has I spoke about history without being asked jar where he has to put money in. So I'll stop talking about the Georgia now, but Smitty, I'm going